Good morning. Wow, we have survivors. It's pretty interesting to see how many people are actually. Probably once the weather gets better, we'll have more people. It depends. But then by the end of the semester, probably be just like Ketty. Because they're trapped here on campus anyway. So, what else would you do? But that could be. But you have other courses, and you have other work, and you have families, and you have dogs to walk, and so I'm competing with all of that stuff, and I know. But today's really important because we're going to do some Aquinas today, and we have to do that in order to move on to the moderns. So next class we do Descartes, for example, and everybody knows you have to do Descartes before you die. You've heard the expression, you have to put Descartes before de Hurst. Okay, that's actually a misconstruction of. That sounds like the evil devil they're showing it. No, there's an expression, you have to put the horse before the cart. The horse before the cart. Because if you put the horse behind the cart, it doesn't work. Because the horses pull the cart.
I understand.
But when I say you have to put Descartes before the hearse, funny because I'm reversing that, plus I'm putting Descartes there instead of cart, and hearse instead of horse.
You know how he died, right?
Please understand I'm not stupid.
He got drunk and then ran out onto or he was just on a road and got run over by a bunch of horses, so that's like double funny.
I thought it was because he went into a bar and someone asked him a question. He says, "I don't think," and he just.
Nice.
But that's, when you get to the deaths of the philosophers, there's like a whole list of them,
Yeah.
and they're all like. Remember, Aristotle died of excessive moderation. Oh well. Okay, so we had been working with Anselm last time. Thank you for all your responses on the pizza question. I wasn't looking for a place with the record largest pizza. I was basically prompting you to think that if there is a pizza, there has to be a largest pizza, a smallest pizza, a grayest pizza, a stalest pizza. It's true of the only pizza there is, if that's the only one there is, just because of the way our language works. So a really good question on the ontological argument, which plays on that whole language principle, is that if we decide that the definition of God is that than which nothing greater can be thought, God must exist, because things do exist. And if you're saying God doesn't exist, you're saying pizza is greater than God. And that's silly, right? Because we insist that no, the definition of God is that in which nothing greater can be thought. And by the way, even though that was 1100 AD, we still use that. A lot of theologians still use that as the minimalist definition of God. So that's good. And in fact, Aquinas uses it also. There is one argument that comes later by the person who actually defined that argument as the ontological argument, and that is Immanuel Kant. And Kant's argument was, it treats existence as if it's a predicate. And Kant says existence is not a predicate. But it seems patently obvious that it is different. Your blue water bottle exists. Your blue water bottle doesn't exist. As you can see, it's not there. it seems to me pretty obvious that existence is a predicate, and Kant is wrong. And subsequent philosophers also argue that Kant's argument is wrong. There is one individual who's he's dead, but Gödel, who gives us an updated version of the ontological argument in symbolic notation. And so if you're into that, notice it's a mathematical argument, basically, saying that there exists something than which nothing greater can be thought, etc. If there exists such a thing, that means it's implication. Okay, so that's fun. And Gödel is a fact. By the way, there's a philosopher named Rebecca Goldstein who wrote a book called Gödel's Proof, I think. Let me double check. Incompleteness, sorry. So she's written a book on that and other proofs. The incompleteness theorem is amazing. But Rebecca Goldstein, if you're familiar with Steven Pinker, anybody? The Harvard psychologist, Steven Pinker? Okay, well, she's his wife, which is just cool. And there's a book she wrote called Proofs for the Existence of God, or Arguments for the Existence of God. It's all about her husband, actually.
And it's funny that she uses her husband as a
They're in cahoots. They're in cahoots with one another.
The qualifications?
Yeah. Because he's an author too. Lots of books out there. Okay, so that's kind of cool. Okay. So historically, what are we looking at? We have to mention Boethius. Boethius is the Latin-speaking scholar who translated some of Aristotle into Latin. As far as we know, maybe the only one who did that. And he was planning on translating all of Aristotle's works. But he was working on the logic books first, and he got pretty far in the logic, and that's why the medieval scholars all had Aristotle's logic to work with, which was really important. But the emperor at the time, who was Theodosius, if I remember correctly, was a follower of Arius. So remember, that's the Christian heresy that the Gnostics followed. And Boethius was a follower of Athanasius, which was the Orthodox, which I keep calling Orthodox, but not to be confused with Greek or Byzantine or Russian Orthodoxy, but instead just the correct dogma, doxa, correct doxa. Ortho means correct, and doxa, which is what the church calls it, right? If you disagree with the church, well, there you go. In fact, by being an American, you're a heretic, whether you wanted to be or not. And that's because it's a heretical imperative. As an American, how many of you believe that you could decide what you believe? Yes? That's heresy. We've grown up thinking, the government gives you a form. Are you an atheist? Are you a Jehovah's Witness? Are you a seventh? What are you? And you get to pick, because it's up to you. Well, today I feel like Buddhist. And that's the heretical imperative, which is also fun. Well, I'll just go. I'm not promoting Amazon, but the heretical imperative. That's a crappy looking cover. My cover is a much better looking cover than that. Notice that's an old book, and Peter Berger is dead, but he's still, I think, on my list of philosophers. If he isn't, he ought to be. I'm pretty sure he is. You can do him, even though he's dead. So in any case, the neat basic argument of this is to just point out that heresy means thinking that you can believe or think for yourself what you want to believe, and that's actually against Orthodox rules. You're not allowed to do that. You have to believe this. Here's the, no, I don't believe that. Heretic! And remember, they used to burn people that, thought for themselves. It was not a good way to end your career. Okay, so that's fun. Just thought I'd throw that in there. And in completeness, we talked about that. But Boethius gives us the logic of Aristotle into Latin, which enabled the medievals to actually have it. They didn't have they lost Aristotle, his works, right? And unfortunately, he also gave us a book called The Consolations of Philosophy, where Sophia comes in and kind of consoles you even though you're in jail, because Theodosius, even though he was one of Theodosius's head advisors and very important in the government, nonetheless at some point Theodosius began to not trust him and threw him in jail, and after he was in there for like a year or so, tortured him and killed him because of the differences between their beliefs, which basically, was, remember, the difference is one iota of difference. Right? Yes? Remember? Talk about it. Okay. So, Boethius, very important. He's also referred to as the last Roman, which is just totally wrong. In lots of ways, but nonetheless, he's called that because some think of him as being like the last one who was part of the old Roman way of thinking, and he's gone. Who else is important? We also have to go back and think about Islam. Muhammad, may his name be praised, right? He's, as you can see, I always think of Islam as really taking off around 650. I guess you could say it's really in the 620s or so. But so you can see the dates 570 to 632 his lifetime. And what we have is Islam. And Islam literally means to submit, if I understand that correctly. Submission to God, right? Why is this important? Well, it's obviously very important because Islam literally becomes an empire and comes very close to becoming a world empire. More than once, what remained of Europe was very tiny and almost disappeared. Spain, especially, was Islamic, and Islam incorporated multiple cultures, so you were allowed to be living in an Islamic state even if you were Jewish or Christian, and they had universities. And by the way, if you've ever been to Spain and you've looked at any of the buildings, they're magnificent, etc., etc., etc. And so lots of influence came from them, including Aristotle's works, because Aristotle wasn't lost to the Middle East. It wasn't in Europe, but they did have access to much of Aristotle. There's still some Aristotle's works